party is over. Canada's interest rates are rising because of all the borrowing that we've done. The government is now feeling the pinch.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Grey, and this is Grey Matter.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Grey Matter. Well, would it shock you to learn that our Canadian government has spent almost $1 trillion over the past 30 years to improve the situation of Indigenous peoples in our country, but that there by any metric that has not occurred, that has not improved the lives of Indigenous people in our country? Would it shock you to learn that large tracts of land in provinces like New Brunswick and British Columbia are about to be ceded to Indigenous peoples under something called UNDRIP? Well, if you're shocked by those things, and I am, then you're probably wondering how we got here. How did this happen? Why is this happening? And are there any solutions? Well, today on the program, we have an acclaimed Canadian scholar who is able to answer some of these questions because he's been writing about this for a long time and actually warning us about that this would happen for many, many years. And his name is Professor Thomas Flanagan. Thanks for being with us today, Professor.
Hi, my pleasure. My pleasure.
All right. So before we dive in, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction of him. But as we always do, we've got some framing quotations, which are somewhat in his honor to reflect some of the things that he's done. The first one is from former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who said, "We have no history of colonialism. So we have all of the things that many people admire about the great powers, but none of the things that threaten or bother them." That's a rather different narrative than what we're hearing from our current federal government. Next, from Preston Manning, who's also someone that our guest knows very well, who said that there are hundreds of Canadian communities that have given more thought to hiring their rink manager than they have to electing their member of parliament. And finally, from a quotation that I note is in a preface to one of our guests' books. This is from Jeremiah chapter 18, verses 1 to 6. "This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Go down at once to the potter's house. There I will reveal my words to you. So I went down to the potter's house, and there he was, working away at the wheel. But the jar that he was making from the clay became flawed in the potter's hand. So he made it into another jar, as it seemed right for him to do." So who do we have on the show today? Well, Professor Thomas Flanagan, Professor Emeritus of Political Science and Distinguished Fellow, School of Policy from the University of Calgary. He's also a Senior Fellow of the Fraser Institute. He's also a Senior Fellow of the Frontier Center for Public Policy, and I must thank them for connecting us with such a great guest. And in the political realm, he managed Stephen Harper's campaigns for leadership of the Canadian Alliance and the Conservative Party of Canada, and in 2004, the Conservative National Campaign, and in 2012, helped Daniel Smith become the Wildrose Alberta leader. Welcome to the show, Professor Flanagan. I want to start off with a piece that you wrote a few months ago that was published in the Fraser Institute website, entitled "Canadian Taxpayers Not Being Consulted About Massive Reparations in First Nations People." And you point out rightly, this reparations is something that's very much in vogue, it seems, in the United States and Canada. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that piece and sort of why this is happening, because as you rightly point out, Canadians really are not being consulted about this process, which seems to be of very, very, very great importance to all of us.
Yeah. Well, I call it reparations by stealth. The word reparations is not used very much in Canada, but in fact, we have a very expensive program of reparations, it's happening through the courts and through the judicial process. It started with compensation for so-called survivors of residential schools, which was the deal was negotiated between Paul Martin's government and Phil Fontaine, who at that time was national chief of the Assembly of First Nations. And just before Martin's government fell in 2005, they signed off on the deal. Harper inherited it when he won the next election, and so he decided to carry through with it. I think he thought that this would put an end to the claims based on the attendance at schools, but in fact, it was just the beginning. About $5 billion was given to the to the survivors. Seems like a lot of money. It is a lot of money, but it unleashed an avalanche of other claims for, well, first of all, for other types of schooling, but then it got outside education. So then there are claims for people who were patients in the Indian hospitals. These no longer exist, but we had about 35 of them in the past. Then there was a claim based on water. Failure to provide drinkable water. That's going to cost the country several $billion. And then the grandfather of all claims for foster care.
Right.
So the amounts of money are huge, and there are still other cases in the pipeline. Of course, you're a lawyer, Leighton. I mean, this is a huge profit center for some law firms, is these class actions, because the settlement inevitably includes payment of legal fees, which can run into the millions. So now what we're going to see in the future is class actions which demand not compensation for individuals, which has been the main theme up till now, is compensation for individuals who allegedly suffered some harm. But it's going to be compensation for aggregations, like compensation for bands or for entire tribes or whatever the aggregation may be. Some of these are coming along now. Like, for example, residential schools are said to have harmed not only the people who attended them, but the communities from which those children were drawn. So now we're going to get class actions to compensate communities for the harm that they suffered as collectivities. Anyway, all of this has happened without prior authorization from Parliament. It's being fed particularly by the practice directive of Jody Wilson-Raybould when she was Minister of Justice, who told the lawyers in the Department of Justice, make every possible effort to settle without litigation, in other words, a negotiated settlement.
Yeah. And that directive is still in effect, isn't it?
Still in effect, yeah. They're still there, and they're still doing it. Now, possibly a new government, if we ever get a different party in power, maybe they can rescind that directive, but it's still in effect. Anyway, so I've worked with these lawyers from the Department of Justice, and these guys can play hardball when they want to.
Yeah.
They will drag.
They certainly did over COVID, I can tell you.
For decades. Yeah. But they've been directed politically not to do their job, just to seek a settlement. And so it's getting crazier and crazier. The amounts of money are huge and growing, and the public don't know. They may see a headline on the news that justice is finally being done, but they don't realize the whole picture, that this has become an industry.
Right.
It's driven by class action law firms, and they go out and they round up the clients, and they go through, get the case certified, and knowing that under this government they'll be able to negotiate a settlement, and the settlement will include legal fees.
Right.
So I call it reparations by stealth.
You've also written in a piece that you published in April that these claims, these programs, are also significantly driving up federal deficits.
Well, of course, ever since the Liberals were elected in 2015, we haven't had a balanced budget. So that means that any incremental money has to be borrowed. It's not like there's a pot of money sitting there to be distributed to First Nations that bring a class action. Basically, the government has to borrow the money or print the money and create it. I mean, there's different ways of calculating it, but overall commitment up to this point for these class actions is about $60 billion. And this is all has to be new money that is not supported by tax revenue. Mm-hmm. So it's been borrowed, mm-hmm. and it's not done yet by any means. I mean, mm-hmm. a lot of these cases have been settled in principle, but it often takes years to find all the members of the class and to compensate them.
Right.
So a lot of this money hasn't yet, it's promised, but it's not yet been paid.
Right. This has actually expanded out into the whole sort of social justice program, though, hasn't it? There's this massive sort of guilt trip that's being perpetrated against the rest of Canada, which finds its expression in things like the whole Kamloops situation, and of course, Truth and Reconciliation Day, all this stuff that seems to be almost an importation of race guilt from the United States under the sort of the aegis of critical race theory.
Yes.
But my question for you, Professor, is what do you think the end game is? Why is this being so much emphasized by our current Liberal government? Is it part of the whole progressive agenda that they seem to be pushing on Canadians?
It is. It's a part of the progressive or woke ideology, according to which all minority groups are oppressed by white males. And this has been working its way now through our public life for probably, almost 50 years. I guess it started with feminism, environmentalism, minority identity politics, most recently attacks upon biology, assertion of rights of sexual minorities, transsexuals, and so forth. The true believers are kind of systematically working through all areas of life looking for victims. In Canada, Native people are a prime candidate for victim status. We don't in the United States. It's more African Americans. Well, we have African Canadians, but proportionally, we don't have the numbers that they do in the United States. So, in Canada, it's been more Native people and it's hard to talk about it because you're not supposed to use the word Indian anymore. So everybody uses the word Indigenous, but that's
we still have the Indian Act though on the books.
I know, yeah, and the word Indian is used in the Constitution of Canada and in legislation and so forth. So people all use the terminology. It's often hard to pin down. They may not even know for sure what they're talking about. Like talking about residential schools. There's a class action coming along to compensate Métis who attended residential schools. Well, they weren't even supposed to go to residential schools. They were residential schools were only for Indians legally. Some Métis were taken in. Or brought into the schools on sort of an act of generosity on the part of those who were running them, but they weren't supposed to be there, and they certainly were only there because their parents wanted them there. Mm-hmm. But now they want compensation too. Mm-hmm. So, but a lot of the coverage of it talks about all the Indigenous people who went to residential schools, but they were Indian residential schools. So it gets broader and broader, looking for more victims to be compensated, and the price tag is getting very, very high. It's not just that it's not just the class actions and the reparations, but the Trudeau government has also pushed the Indian Affairs budget to record highs. I call it Indian Affairs. It's the old Indian Affairs Department was divided into two different departments, but the budget of those two departments together is now bigger. It's greater than what we spend on national defense. Mm-hmm. And it's expanding every year, partly due to payouts for these social justice claims, but partly just due to enhancement of programming, and bringing in new categories. So now we have programs for Métis people in what used to be Indian Affairs. So serving more people, paying out more money, spending more every year. Well, now you have authorities like David Dodge in the financial area say the party is over. Canada's interest rates are rising because of all the borrowing that we've done. The government is now feeling the pinch in having to pay out, what is it, the most recent figure of $40 billion a year or something in interest payments, and it'll be rising. Nothing goes on forever. I think we're reaching some kind of limit of practicality.
Right.
But for a long time, it seemed to be affordable because you could keep borrowing the money. And so you didn't have the immediate pain. But now the pain is becoming immediate. And I think that's one of the factors that's driving what's happened in the polls, public opinion polls, with the conservatives moving forward, the liberals dropping back. It's chickens coming home to roost. The practical effects of programs could be postponed and hidden for a while, but you can't do that forever. They does eventually become manifest.
Mm-hmm. Part of what this expansion of programming is in response to the courts taking an activist approach to treaty interpretation, though, too, isn't it?
Yes.
For example, there was a time, and you know this very well, better than most, when Métis were not considered to have the same necessarily constitutional rights or treaty rights as First Nations peoples, as they're called now. But the courts have now have sort of brought them into the party, haven't they? And so the courts have a very activist role, and they seem to be supporting everything the federal government is saying. How is that unfolding?
Well, yeah, this is again a huge factor. It has to do probably with legal education in Canada, that the legal law schools were taken over at an early date by adherents of the woke ideology or progressivism, and that's what's being taught in the schools. And so you get generations of lawyers coming out believing this stuff, and then they get appointed to the bench as judges. So yeah, a couple of the landmarks here. Reinterpretation of Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 to create a duty of consultation and accommodation. It starts with in British Columbia, where there were no treaties, most of the province. It actually makes some sense if you have a potential Aboriginal rights claim which has never been dealt with. Is it fair for the government to allow let's say a logging company to come in and cut all the timber, which degrades the value of your land, or maybe it's not your land exactly, but land on which you may have a claim. So I could see the original decision, but then the courts expanded it into Alberta, where treaties already exist. So now we have the duty of consultation, even where land has been ceded under treaty. First Nations are still claiming the right to be consulted on so-called traditional lands, which the concept very poorly defined. What is traditional territory? Could be almost anywhere. So yeah, this is all judge-made law. Then you mentioned the Métis. Well, the Daniels decision. I was originally hired as a historical consultant in Daniels. I'm always my own worst enemy. They had an all female team from the Department of Justice. So I went up to see them in Edmonton. I walked in. I said, "Gee, I never played in a girls' band before." Anyway, I wrote a report for them, but they decided that they didn't want me to testify, and of course they lost the case. So the result is that the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, declared Métis to be Indians. Yeah. Insane historically. I mean, I had reams of evidence that I'd collected showing how from the beginning Métis were always considered to be different from Indians. But anyway, in their wisdom, they decided they didn't need me as a witness on the case. So yeah, and there's court decisions almost every day. Now there's a new one from British Columbia saying that UNDRIP requires consultation with local Indians before you can have not open a mine, but just establish a mining claim. It was already understood that you'd have to have consultation before you opened the mine, but even now, even to get the claim, you're going to have to consult first. So it adds another layer of consultation. Time is money. It means that fewer and fewer claims will ever be filed because it's going to take longer and longer to do it. Mm-hmm. Again, all totally judge-made law. In this case, in the interpretation of UNDRIP doesn't state anything like that, so it's judges' views about what UNDRIP implies.
In the net result, though, it doesn't seem to be improving the station of First Nations peoples in terms of health or wealth or education or any other metric. And in fact, you've been warning about this for some time. You published a book in 2008 called First Nations Second Thoughts, where you started to question some of these policies, really before, in a way that was sort of somewhat prescient. And you've written about this recently, where you're saying that actually there is another way. There are better ways to improve the station of First Nations peoples and communities in our country, instead of just writing them government checks. And one of them you talk about is entrepreneurship. You want to talk about that a little bit? One of your solutions to the problem?
Yeah. Let me just back up and say the one group that we can measure fairly well is First Nations people living on reserve, because a metric has been established. The index it's an index of standard of living on reserve, and
Right.
it's been going up gradually, as it has for the rest of Canada. You can compute the index for the rest of Canada too. And as we become a wealthier nation, the index is going up. But on reserves, it's not going up any faster than in the rest of the country, even though the spending has been multiplied.
Right.
So the standard of living seems to be independent of these increases in spending. So when I saw that, I said, well, gee whiz, what is there that works? So I started looking at First Nations that whose standard of living has been increasing disproportionately. And what do they have in common? And there are some. There's quite a few. There's dozens who've been doing very well. And what they had in common was entrepreneurship, participation in the Canadian economy. Broadly speaking, there's two types. One is those who have a reserve that's close to a metropolitan area, and they take advantage of that. If you're close to Vancouver or Calgary, there are all kinds of economic opportunities there. And so there's some good news stories there. Or the other type is natural resource development. If you happen to be situated in an oil field or near some kind of mining play. So I did a couple of case studies. One is the Fort McKay, and their far-sighted chief said, hey, we've got to start getting in on the action. And it wasn't producing oil for this particular First Nation. It was creating service companies, well site maintenance, workforce lodging, things like that. And their curve just went up like that. It was just incredible.
Yeah.
And you walk around that community today, it looks like a suburb of Edmonton, not like a typical Indian reserve. The other case study I did was Westbank First Nation in British Columbia on the shores of Okanagan Lake. Huge real estate boom there. So it's very, very different from Fort McKay, different approach to prosperity, but the common denominator is seeing the opportunity and taking advantage of it and doing what needs to be done to marketize the value of their land. They found a way around Indian Act definition of land rights so that they could create long-term leases for developers or for home builders. And it's been a huge source of revenue that comes to them through property tax on development fees, or just having people there who want to do business because now they're living there. We need to spend more time studying the success. Another common factor is these First Nations who have succeeded. They've done it themselves. They didn't go to the government and say, hey, we need special grant to do this. They said, hey, we've got to get in business. Sometimes they had to fight the government to get around rules which were preventing them from getting into business.
You and Jack Mintz with Ted Morton wrote a very fascinating book that I read recently, A Moment of Truth, How to Think of Alberta's Future. And this book was written some years ago, but it's certainly very relevant at the moment because of what's going on in terms of the, let's call it the sovereignty debate that's going on as between Alberta, provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan and Ottawa, which, as you know, has been going on for a very long time. But in that book, you lay out the case historically very well in terms of this moment of truth. Do you think that moment of truth has arrived for the province of Alberta?
Well, it's more than actually, the term "moment of truth" was chosen by the publisher. We didn't come up with that phrase, but he thought the book would sell better if it had this sort of apocalyptic title, "Moment of Truth." So, titles, that's the publisher's prerogative. In my view, it's a marketing decision. But we are at a really important, not moment, but a really important stretch of time,
Right.
in which the future of Alberta is at stake, because we're not exactly a single industry province, but there's no question that oil and gas is by far our most important industry now. And the federal government is very hostile to it. And some in the federal government would like to shut it down altogether. Others just want to trim it back. And we have to keep resisting that. And Danielle has come up, she and advisors come up with something that we hadn't thought of in our book, but the Sovereignty Act. Now, originally, the Sovereignty Act, in my view, was a non-starter. There was no way that you would ever be able to get that through the courts when it came to a test. But the revised version of the Sovereignty Act just allows the provincial government to instruct provincial agencies to ignore federal legislation, which seems to go outside the constitutional authority of the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's at least viable as something that you could defend in court. So yeah, it's a tough struggle. There's no question about it.
Thank you so much for sharing an hour or so of your time with us and your expansive knowledge of wisdom and experience in the Canadian political scene and historical scene. And we thank you so much for being with us. We look forward to hopefully talking to you again when your new book comes out. And we wish you much success with that. Thanks for being our very special guest here today on Grey Matter today.
Yeah, the tentative title of the new book is hasn't been typeset yet, but it's what was it? The Kamloops myths and the madness of crowds.
Well, I'm glad to hear the Douglas Murray reference and that you're not leaving this title up to the publisher.
Well, we negotiate back and forth, but
okay.
No, they were willing to accept our suggestions.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. It's been a pleasure having this time with you today.